In the moonless nights of 1887, the residents of Ravenshollow would wake to find their cemetery gates wide open, freshly dug earth scattered across tombstones, and empty coffins lying askew in the morning mist. What they discovered beneath the soil would challenge everything they believed about death itself. Ravenshollow, Massachusetts had always been a peculiar place, nestled in the shadow of the Berkshire Mountains like a secret whispered between ancient peaks. Founded in 1743 by Puritan settlers seeking isolation from Salem's lingering hysteria, the town had grown slowly, deliberately, its population never exceeding 300 souls. The cobblestone streets wound through neat rows of colonial houses, their windows reflecting the pale New England sky with an almost ethereal quality that visitors found unsettling. By 1887, Ravenshollow had earned a reputation throughout western Massachusetts for two things: the exceptional longevity of its residents and the pristine condition of its cemetery. While neighboring towns buried their dead in overcrowded plots that quickly fell into disrepair, Ravenshollow Cemetery remained immaculate. The wrought iron gates, imported from Boston at considerable expense, never showed rust. The marble headstones gleamed as if carved yesterday, their inscriptions sharp and clear despite decades of harsh winters. Dr. Elias Thornfield, who had served as the town's physician and unofficial record-keeper for 37 years, often marveled at the statistical anomaly his community represented. In his leather-bound journal, he documented case after case of residents living well into their 80s and 90s, their minds sharp, their bodies remarkably preserved. The average life expectancy in Ravenshollow exceeded the national average by nearly 2 decades, a fact that drew curious academics from Harvard and Yale. The cemetery itself, a cup-eyed 5 acres of gently sloping land on the town's eastern edge, bordered by a dense forest of oak and maple trees that seemed to grow taller and thicker with each passing year. Local folklore claimed the soil possessed healing properties, blessed by some forgotten ritual performed by the original settlers. Children were taught to speak in whispers when passing the cemetery gates, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what the townspeople called sacred ground. Thomas Blackthorne, the cemetery caretaker since 1861, maintained the grounds with an almost religious devotion. His weathered hands knew every headstone, every pathway, every inch of earth under his care. He lived in a small cottage adjacent to the cemetery, its windows offering an unobstructed view of the burial grounds. Neighbors often remarked that Thomas seemed to never sleep, his lantern visible through the mist at all hours of the night as he tended to his eternal charges. But in the autumn of 1887, something changed in Ravenshollow. The change began subtly, like a discordant note in a familiar hymn, barely perceptible but impossible to ignore once noticed. If the residents had known what was stirring beneath their feet, would they have fled before the first grave opened itself to the October moon? Thomas Blackthorne had seen many strange things during his 26 years tending Ravenshollow Cemetery, but nothing had prepared him for the night of October 13, 1887. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay despite the crisp autumn weather, and an unnatural silence had settled over the grounds like a burial shroud. Even the ever-present rustle of leaves seemed muted, as if the very forest held its breath in anticipation. Thomas made his evening rounds as always, his brass lantern casting dancing shadows across the weathered headstones. The flame flickered more than usual despite the absence of wind, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made the cemetery appear to pulse with hidden life. He had noticed the phenomenon for 3 consecutive nights, along with other subtle disturbances that his experienced eye couldn't dismiss as imagination. The soil around certain graves appeared darker, richer than the surrounding earth, though no recent burials had taken place. Mrs. Abigail Whitmore's headstone, marking her resting place since 1881, seemed to emanate a faint warmth when Thomas pressed his palm against the cold marble. The sensation was so pronounced that he jerked his hand away, staring at his fingers as if they had betrayed him. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that emerged after midnight. Thomas had initially attributed the soft scraping noises to settling earth, or perhaps small animals burrowing through the cemetery grounds. But as the nights progressed, the sounds grew more distinct, more purposeful. They came from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails clawing against wood or stone being scraped against stone. On this particular night, Thomas decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. Armed with his lantern and a small spade, he approached the Whitmore grave where the sounds seemed strongest. The earth around the headstone had formed a slight depression, as if the ground itself was slowly sinking. When Thomas pressed his ear to the soil, his blood turned to ice. From 6 feet below came the unmistakable sound of knocking. 3 deliberate raps, followed by silence, then 3 more raps. The pattern repeated with metronomic precision, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Thomas scrambled backward, his lantern crashing to the ground and extinguishing instantly, plunging him into absolute darkness. In the suffocating blackness that followed, Thomas heard something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days, the grinding, scraping sound of wood against earth, growing louder and more insistent. Somewhere in the cemetery, something was pushing its way up from below, fighting against 6 feet of packed soil with inhuman determination. Would you have the courage to investigate further, or would you run, screaming, into the night? Dr. Elias Thornfield received Thomas Blackthorn's frantic summons at precisely 3:47 in the morning, the urgent pounding on his door rousing him from uneasy dreams filled with shadowy figures and open graves. The caretaker stood on his threshold, wild-eyed and trembling, his clothes caked with cemetery dirt, and his hands bloodied from clawing at the frozen ground in his desperate escape from whatever he had encountered. "Doctor, you must come," Thomas gasped, his breath forming ghostly vapors in the frigid October air. "The cemetery. Something's happening. Something unholy." His voice cracked with exhaustion and terror, words tumbling over each other as he described the sounds from beneath the earth, the knocking, the voices, the sense of presence that had nearly driven him to madness. Dr. Thornfield, despite his scientific skepticism, recognized genuine trauma when he saw it. Thomas Blackthorn was not a man given to flights of fancy or superstitious hysteria. In their decades of acquaintance, the caretaker had proven himself to be methodical, rational, and unshakable in his devotion to duty. If Thomas claimed something supernatural was occurring in the cemetery, the doctor felt compelled to investigate. Armed with medical supplies, lanterns, and a resolve strengthened by professional curiosity, the 2 men made their way through the pre-dawn darkness toward the cemetery gates. The wrought iron barriers stood partially open, though Thomas swore he had secured them before his evening rounds. Fresh scratches marred the metal, deep gouges that appeared to have been carved from the inside, as if desperate hands had clawed at the gates in an attempt to escape. As they approached the Whitmore grave, Dr. Thornfield's scientific mind struggled to process what his senses reported. The air temperature around the burial site measured several degrees warmer than the surrounding area, creating visible steam that rose from the disturbed earth like breath on a winter morning. The soil itself pulsed gently, rising and falling in a rhythm that mimicked human respiration. Most disturbing of all was the condition of the grave marker. The marble headstone, previously pristine and perfectly vertical, now tilted at an impossible angle, as if enormous pressure had pushed it from beneath. Carved letters that had remained sharp and clear for 6 years appeared worn and weathered, as though decades had passed in a single night. When Dr. Thornfield pressed his stethoscope to the ground above Abigail Whitmore's coffin, his face went ashen. The amplified sounds that reached his ears defied all medical explanation. A slow, steady heartbeat echoing from the depths, accompanied by the rhythmic expansion and contraction of what could only be described as breathing lungs. Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was medical anomaly or something far darker awakening beneath Ravenshollow? Dawn broke grey and reluctant over Ravenshollow Cemetery on October the 14th, 1887, casting long shadows across ground that no longer seemed solid or trustworthy. Dr. Thornfield and Thomas Blackthorn had maintained their vigil throughout the night, documenting phenomena that challenged everything the physician understood about death, decomposition, and the natural order of existence. At precisely 6:23 in the morning, as church bells rang across the valley calling the faithful to morning prayers, the earth above Abigail Whitmore's grave began to bulge upward like a bubble rising through thick liquid. The two men watched in horrified fascination as soil cracked and shifted, creating a widening fissure that released a putrid exhalation of that had been trapped underground for 6 years. The smell that emerged defied description, not the expected odor of decay and corruption, but something far more unsettling, the scent of fresh flowers mixed with burning sulfur, as if death itself had been perfumed for some macabre celebration. Dr. Thornfield covered his nose with his handkerchief, but the aroma seemed to penetrate every pore, leaving a metallic taste on his tongue that lingered for hours. What emerged from the grave challenged every medical text Dr. Thornfield had studied during his years at Harvard Medical School. A pale hand, perfectly preserved despite 6 years of burial, pushed through the soil with deliberate, purposeful movements. The flesh appeared neither decomposed nor discolored, maintaining the translucent quality of living tissue while emanating an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Thomas stumbled backward, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, as something that had once been Abigail Whitmore pulled itself free from the confines of her coffin and the embrace of the earth. Her burial dress, an elegant navy silk chosen by her grieving family, remained pristine and unwrinkled, as if she had been sleeping peacefully in a comfortable bed rather than decomposing in a wooden box 6 feet underground. But it was Abigail's eyes that would haunt both men for the remainder of their lives. Clear, alert, and undeniably alive, they fixed upon the two witnesses with an intelligence that suggested consciousness, awareness, and something approaching recognition. Her lips, still retaining the natural pink color they had possessed in life, moved silently as if attempting to form words that her resurrected vocal cords could not yet produce. Dr. Thornfield reached for his medical bag with 2 trembling hands, his scientific training warring with primal terror as he witnessed the impossible, before he could determine his next course of action. Abigail Whitmore sat up completely, turned her unnaturally bright gaze upon him, and spoke her first words in 6 years. "What would you do if faced with the impossible resurrection of someone you had personally pronounced dead?" "The hunger," Abigail Whitmore whispered, her voice carrying the hollow echo of wind through empty caverns. "The terrible, endless hunger that gnaws from within." Her words emerged slowly, deliberately, as if she were learning to speak again after years of silence. The sound sent ice through Dr. Thornfield's veins, not because it was horrifying, but because it was heartbreakingly human. Thomas Blackthorne crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers he had learned at his mother's knee, but his eyes remained fixed on the impossible sight before them. Abigail's movements were fluid, graceful even, as she pulled herself fully from the grave that had been her home for 6 years. Soil fell from her burial dress in cascades, revealing fabric that should have rotted to threads, but instead appeared freshly pressed. Dr. Thornfield forced his scientific mind to engage, pushing aside terror in favor of observation. He noted that Abigail cast no shadow despite the morning sunlight streaming through the cemetery trees. Her skin, while pale, retained a subtle warmth that his medical thermometer confirmed was several degrees above normal human temperature. Most disturbing of all was her pulse. When he finally summoned the courage to check her wrist, he found it beating at twice the normal rate, as if her resurrected heart was working desperately to circulate blood through veins that had been still for years. "What do you hunger for, Abigail?" Dr. Thornfield asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His medical training compelled him to treat her as a patient, despite the impossibility of her condition. She turned toward him with movements that seemed to flow like water, her neck rotating further than human anatomy should allow. "Life," she replied, reaching toward him with fingers that ended in nails grown long and sharp during her underground imprisonment, the warmth that flows through living veins, the breath that fills living lungs, the memories that dance behind living eyes. Her own eyes began to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. As if responding to some unheard signal, the ground throughout the cemetery began to tremble and shift. Thomas pointed with a shaking hand toward other graves where similar bulges were forming in the earth, where headstones were tilting at impossible angles, where the morning mist was beginning to carry voices speaking in languages that predated the founding of Ravenshollow. Abigail smiled then, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished pearls in her perfectly preserved face. "We have all been so very hungry," she said, her gaze sweeping across the cemetery where dozens of graves were beginning to stir with unnatural life. "And now, finally, the feast can begin." If you lived in Ravenshollow, would you have stayed to help, or run before the real horror began? The trembling beneath their feet intensified as more graves throughout Ravenshollow Cemetery began to respond to whatever force had awakened Abigail Whitmore. Dr. Thornfield watched in scientific horror as the carefully maintained burial ground transformed into a landscape of impossible resurrection, where death itself seemed to be reversing its ancient claim on the town's departed. The headstone of Jeremiah Morse, a blacksmith who had died of consumption in 1883, toppled forward with a grinding crash that echoed across the valley. From the exposed earth emerged a hand blackened by years of working with iron and fire, followed by arms that retained the powerful musculature of his profession. Unlike Abigail's pristine preservation, Jeremiah's resurrection came with visible signs of his underground ordeal, soil caked beneath his fingernails, roots woven through his hair, and eyes that reflected the absolute darkness he had endured. Thomas Blackthorne stumbled from grave to grave, his caretaker's instincts compelling him to document the systematic destruction of everything he had spent decades maintaining. The Caldwell family plot, containing the remains of a mother, father, and 3 children who had perished in the influenza outbreak of 1879, erupted simultaneously. 5 figures clawed their way free from the earth, their burial clothes hanging in tatters, their faces bearing expressions of confusion and desperate hunger. Dr. Thornfield attempted to approach young Rebecca Caldwell, a girl of 7 whose death he had attended personally. Her small form sat at the edge of her grave, dirt cascading from her Sunday dress, her blue eyes now holding depths of knowledge that no child should possess. When she turned toward him, her voice carried the weight of years spent in contemplation of darkness. "Doctor," she said, her words accompanied by small puffs of vapor that smelled of earth and decay. "We remember everything, every moment in the ground, every root that grew through our coffins, every worm that made its home in our flesh." Her innocent face twisted into an expression of ancient suffering. "And we remember you. We remember all of you." The awakening spread with geometric progression across the cemetery grounds. Headstones tilted and fell as their occupants pushed upward from below. Fresh mounds of earth appeared as those buried deeper began their longer journey to the surface, the morning air filled with sounds that had never been heard before, the crack of splitting coffin wood, the whisper of soil sliding across fabric, and underneath it all a low harmonic hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Abigail Whitmore rose to her feet with inhuman grace, her burial dress flowing around her like liquid shadows. She surveyed the chaos with satisfaction before fixing her luminous gaze on Dr. Thornfield and Thomas. "Now you begin to understand," she said, gesturing toward the growing army of resurrected dead. "Death was never the end in Ravenshollow. It was only the beginning." As the resurrected residents of Ravenshollow Cemetery pulled themselves free from their earthen prisons, Dr. Thornfield's mind raced through decades of medical records, searching for patterns he had previously overlooked. The statistical anomalies that had made their community famous, the exceptional longevity, the pristine preservation of the cemetery, the unusual health of the townspeople, suddenly took on a sinister significance that chilled him more than the October morning air. Thomas Blackthorne, his caretaker's knowledge spanning every burial since 1861, began to piece together a horrifying timeline. "Doctor," he whispered, pointing toward the growing congregation of the awakened dead. "Every one of them. They all lived past 80. Every single soul who's risen from these graves saw their 90th year or beyond." The realization struck Dr. Thornfield like a physical blow. In his meticulous records, he had documented the remarkable health and longevity of Ravenshollow's residents, attributing it to clean mountain air, pure well water, and the peaceful lifestyle of rural New England. But now, faced with the impossible resurrection of those same long-lived individuals, he began to suspect that their extended years had come at a price that the living had never imagined. Abigail Whitmore approached them with steps that left no imprint in the soft cemetery earth, her presence somehow lighter than air, yet more substantial than stone. "You kept such careful records, Doctor," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies beyond hum and hearing. "But you never asked the right questions. You never wondered why death came so peacefully to us, why our final moments were filled with such strange contentment." Behind her, the other awakened dead began to form loose clusters around their family plots, their movements coordinated as if responding to some shared consciousness. The Morse family gathered near the blacksmith's forge that had been their livelihood. The Caldwells arranged themselves in the same formation they had maintained in life, parents protective, children obedient, all united in their newfound purpose. "The soil of Ravenshollow is blessed," continued Abigail, kneeling to let the cemetery earth run through her fingers like black sand. "Blessed with properties that preserve not just the body, but the essence of life itself. We who lived long upon this ground, who drew our sustenance from its bounty, became part of something greater than individual existence." Dr. Thornfield watched in growing horror as more figures emerged from graves throughout the cemetery. Some had been buried for decades, others for mere months, but all shared the same otherworldly preservation, the same luminous vitality that defied natural law. The cemetery that had been Ravenshollow's pride was revealing itself to be something far more complex and terrifying than a simple burial ground. Tell me, in the comments, do you believe some places hold power over life and death itself? The awakened dead of Ravenshollow moved with purpose now, their initial confusion giving way to a collective understanding that transcended individual consciousness. Dr. Thornfield observed their behavior with the clinical detachment his medical training demanded, even as terror coursed through his veins like poison. Each resurrected figure retained their personal identity, their faces, their mannerisms, their distinctive characteristics, yet they operated as parts of a larger organism, responding to impulses that seemed to originate from the cemetery itself. Young Rebecca Caldwell, a Proez, chid Dr. Thornfield with the innocent trust she had shown him in life, but her words carried knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess. "The hunger isn't for food, Doctor," she explained, her small hand reaching for his with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in silk. "It's for the warmth that connects all living things, the spark that makes hearts beat and minds dream, and souls remember what it feels like to truly exist." Thomas Blackthorne backed away as more figures emerged from the family plots he had tended for decades. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who had died at 93 in 1885, pulled herself from the earth with surprising agility. Her white hair flowed around her shoulders like spun silver, and her eyes held the accumulated wisdom of nearly a century of life, followed by years of conscious death. "Thomas," she called to him, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she had possessed as the town's schoolteacher. "You have been faithful in your service to us. You have kept our resting places clean and our memories honored. Now it is time for us to return that care." The cemetery grounds continued to erupt with systematic precision. Headstones throughout the 5 acres tilted and fell as their occupants answered some unheard summons. The morning mist began to carry whispers in languages that predated English settlement, Native American words perhaps, or something even older that had dwelt in this soil since before human memory began. Dr. Thornfield realized with growing dread that the awakening was not random. The dead were rising in chronological order, beginning with the most recently deceased and working backward through decades of burials. Abigail Whitmore, dead only 6 years, had been the first to emerge. Now those who had rested longer were stirring, their resurrection requiring more time and effort, but proceeding with inevitable determination. "What do you want from us?" Dr. Thornfield asked. his voice barely audible above the sounds of splitting earth and cracking wood that filled the morning air. Abigail smiled with lips that held no warmth despite their perfect preservation. "We want to live again, Doctor, and you who have cared for us in life and death. You will help us remember how. Would you have the courage to face what the dead truly hunger for?" The awakened dead began their approach toward the town of Ravenshollow, just as the morning church bells completed their call to worship. Dr. Thornfield and Thomas Blackthorne found themselves caught between the cemetery and the community they had sworn to protect, witnesses to an impossible phenomenon that defied every natural law they understood. Abigail Whitmore led the procession with the stately grace she had possessed in life, her burial dress flowing behind her like liquid shadow. The other resurrected followed in loose formation, their movements synchronized despite the absence of any visible communication between them. They walked without urgency, as if they had all the time in eternity to accomplish their mysterious purpose. The first resident to encounter them was young Timothy Fletcher, age 12, who had risen early to tend his family's chickens before Sunday services. Timothy stopped mid-step when he saw the procession emerging from the tree line that separated the cemetery from the town proper, his young mind struggling to process the impossible sight of the dead walking among the living. "Mrs. Whitmore," Timothy called out, recognizing his late Sunday school teacher despite the ethereal glow that surrounded her form. "Ma'am, we thought you were—" "We attended your funeral, ma'am. We watched them lower your coffin into the ground." Abigail paused in her approach, tilting her head with an expression of genuine fondness for the confused boy. "Timothy," she replied, her voice carrying the same patient warmth she had used when teaching him scripture. "I remember you. Such a Briggs. A child, always asking questions about heaven and angels and what happens to souls when bodies fail them." Dr. Thornfield stepped forward, his medical training compelling him to intervene despite his terror. "Timothy, move away from them slowly," he instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos of his thoughts. "Come toward me, son." But Timothy seemed transfixed by Abigail's presence, drawn to her with the same trust he had shown in life. "Are you angels now, Mrs. Whitmore? Did God send you back to teach us something important?" The other awakened dead arranged themselves in a semicircle around the boy, their expressions uniformly gentle yet somehow predatory. Mrs. Hartwell, the former schoolteacher, approached from Timothy's left side with the measured steps she had used when patrolling her classroom. Jeremiah Morse, the blacksmith, positioned himself to the boy's right, his powerful frame casting a shadow despite the morning sun. "We have indeed learned something important, Timothy," Abigail replied, reaching toward the child with pale fingers that seemed to glow with internal light. "We have learned that the boundary between life and death is far more permeable than anyone imagined. Imagine this was your child. What would you have done to save them?" Timothy Fletcher's scream echoed across the valley like a clarion call, alerting every resident of Ravenshollow to the horror unfolding at their town's edge. But the sound that emerged from the 12-year-old boy was unlike any cry of fear or pain Dr. Thornfield had ever heard in his decades of medical practice. It was a sound of transformation, of something fundamental being altered at the cellular level. Abigail Whitmore's pale hand made contact with Timothy's forehead, and immediately the boy's eyes began to change. The warm brown irises that had sparkled with childhood curiosity transformed into the same low-soared, luminous quality possessed by the awakened dead. His skin took on a translucent pallor that seemed to glow from within, and his breath became visible in small puffs of vapor despite the warming morning air. "The connection," whispered Rebecca Caldwell, her child's voice filled with ancient knowledge. "He feels it now, the link that binds all life in Ravenshollow to something greater than individual existence." Dr. Thornfield lunged forward, his medical instincts overriding his terror, but Thomas Blackthorne caught his arm with surprising strength. "Doctor, no," the caretaker hissed. "Look at the boy's face. He's not in pain." Indeed, Timothy's expression had shifted from fear to wonder, as Abigail's touch continued. His young features remained unchanged, but something behind his eyes suggested an expansion of consciousness, an awakening to realities that had previously been hidden from living perception. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that resonated with the same otherworldly frequencies as the resurrected dead. "I can see it," Timothy breathed, his gaze moving across the cemetery grounds with new understanding. "The network beneath the soil, the connections that link every person who has ever lived in Ravenshollow, we're all part of something beautiful, something eternal." The transformation appeared to be reversible, at least initially. As Abigail withdrew her hand, Timothy's eyes returned to their natural brown, though they retained a subtle luminescence that suggested permanent change. His skin regained its normal coloration, but the boy himself seemed somehow more substantial, more present than he had been moments before. "Timothy," Dr. Thornfield called softly, approaching with the caution he would use with a wild animal. "How do you feel, son?" The boy turned toward him with a smile that was both innocent and knowing. "I feel connected, Doctor, to everyone and everything in Ravenshollow. The living and the dead, we're all part of the same tapestry." He gestured toward the awakened figures surrounding them. "They're not monsters, they're family." Behind Timothy, the church bells of Ravenshollow rang out across the valley, calling the faithful to morning worship, unaware that their definition of faith was about to undergo a radical transformation. Would you have tried to save Timothy, or would you have run to warn the others? The congregation of Ravenshollow's First Baptist Church had gathered as they did every Sunday morning, their voices raised in hymns that had echoed through the valley for over a century. Pastor Ezekiel Morrison led them in Amazing Grace, the familiar melody floating through open windows to mix with the crisp October air. None of the faithful suspected that their definition of grace was about to be challenged in ways their theology had never contemplated. Dr. Thornfield burst through the church doors during the second verse, his clothes disheveled and his face pale with exhaustion and terror. Behind him came Thomas Blackthorne, supporting young Timothy Fletcher, whose appearance immediately caused murmurs of concern throughout the congregation. The boy's skin retained an otherworldly luminescence, and his eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed impossible for his 12 years. "Brothers and sisters," Dr. Thornfield called out, his voice cutting through the hymn like a blade, "there is something you must know, something that challenges everything we understand about life, death, and the nature of our community." Pastor Morrison raised his hand to quiet the congregation, his weathered face showing concern for the obvious distress of 3 of his most trusted parishioners. "Dr. Thornfield, Thomas, what has happened? Is the boy injured?" Before anyone could answer, the church doors opened again, and Abigail Whitmore entered with the same quiet dignity she had possessed in life. Her appearance caused an immediate hush to fall over the congregation, followed by gasps of recognition and disbelief. Several women fainted outright, while others crossed themselves repeatedly, their prayers becoming desperate whispers that filled the sudden silence. "Abigail!" Pastor Morrison's voice cracked with emotion as he recognized his former parishioner. "Child, we buried you. We mourned you. We committed your soul to the Lord's keeping 6 years ago." Abigail moved down the center aisle with fluid grace, her burial dress rustling softly against the wooden pews. Behind her, more figures began to enter the church, Rebecca Caldwell holding her mother's hand, Jeremiah Morse ducking slightly to fit his tall frame through the doorway, Mrs. Hartwell carrying herself with the authority she had possessed as the town's educator. "Pastor Morrison," Abigail replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary without effort. "We have not come to challenge your faith, but to expand it. The Lord works in ways that transcend human understanding, and Ravenshollow has been blessed with a gift that defies conventional wisdom." The congregation sat frozen in their pews, torn between terror and wonder as they beheld their risen neighbors. Some wept openly, while others stared in fascination at friends and family members they had mourned for years. The church that had been their sanctuary was becoming the stage for a revelation that would reshape their understanding of mortality itself. Tell me in the comments, would your faith survive witnessing the impossible? Pastor Ezekiel Morrison's hands trembled as he gripped the pulpit, his 47 years of faithful service providing no framework for the impossibility unfolding before his eyes. The awakened dead continued to file into his sanctuary, taking seats in pews they had occupied in life, their presence both comforting and terrifying to the congregation they had once worshipped alongside. "This cannot be," Pastor Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft wetim, weeping and whispered prayers that filled the church. Scripture tells us that the dead rest until the final judgment. This challenges every doctrine, every promise of resurrection that I have preached from this pulpit. Abigail Whitmore approached the altar with reverent steps, her luminous eyes fixed upon the simple wooden cross that dominated the front wall of the sanctuary. "Pastor," she said gently, "perhaps your scriptures are incomplete. Perhaps there are mysteries of faith that have yet to be revealed to human understanding." The congregation watched in stunned silence as their former neighbors settled into familiar routines. Mrs. Hartwell took her usual seat in the third pew, where she had sat every Sunday for 60 years. The Caldwell family arranged themselves in their customary order, parents flanking children, all maintaining the discipline they had practiced in life. Even in death, they seemed to honor the traditions that had structured their mortal existence. Dr. Thornfield stepped forward, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile observation with belief. "Pastor, I have examined these individuals. They possess no pulse as we understand it, no breath as we measure it, yet they demonstrate consciousness, memory, and apparent emotion. They defy every medical principle I have studied, yet they stand before us with undeniable reality." Young Timothy Fletcher, still glowing with the subtle luminescence imparted by Abigail's touch, tugged at Dr. Thornfield's coat. "Tell them about the connection," he urged, his child's voice carrying undertones of ancient wisdom. "Tell them how we're all part of something bigger than we ever imagined." Pastor Morrison descended from the pulpit on unsteady legs, approaching Abigail with the mixture of fear and fascination that had characterized his entire relationship with divine mystery. "If this is God's work," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "then why do I feel such dread? Why does every instinct warn me that this resurrection brings danger rather than blessing?" Abigail reached toward him with pale fingers that seemed to pulse with inner light. "Because true faith requires the courage to embrace mysteries that challenge comfortable assumptions. Because some gifts from the divine come wrapped in forms that test the strength of human belief." Outside the church, the bells of Ravenshollow continued their call to worship, unaware that the nature of worship itself was about to be forever changed. If you were in that congregation, would you have welcomed the risen dead or fled in terror? As Abigail Whitmore's pale fingers made contact with Pastor Morrison's forehead, a transformation swept through the entire congregation of First Baptist Church. The touch that had awakened new awareness in young Timothy Fletcher now expanded to encompass every living soul within the sanctuary, creating a network of consciousness that transcended individual identity. The pastor's eyes widened as impossible visions flooded his mind. Images of Ravenshollow's soil permeated with threads of light that connected every grave, every home, every living being in an intricate web of shared existence. He saw the town's history not as a linear progression of births and deaths, but as a complex tapestry where each life added another strand to an ever-growing pattern of consciousness. "The soil," Pastor Morrison gasped, his voice filled with wonder and terror. "The blessed soil that has sustained our community for generations. It's not just earth. It's a living network that preserves and connects every soul who has ever drawn breath in Ravenshollow." Throughout the congregation, similar revelations rippled from person to person. Mrs. Sarah Pennington, the town's seamstress, suddenly understood why her late husband appeared in her dreams with such vivid clarity. Mr. Joseph Crane, the banker, realized that his deceased father's voice in times of crisis was not imagination, but genuine communication through the network that bound all Ravenshollow residents together. Dr. Thornfield watched in fascination as the entire congregation began to glow with the same subtle luminescence that marked Timothy Fletcher and the awakened dead. The transformation appeared to be spreading through proximity, creating a shared consciousness that allowed the living to perceive the true nature of their community's supernatural blessing. "We have always been connected," explained Rebecca Caldwell, her child's voice now speaking for the collective wisdom of the awakened. Death in Ravenshollow was never an ending. It was a transition to a deeper level of participation in the network that sustains all life here. The church building itself seemed to pulse with newfound energy as the barrier between living and dead dissolved. Stained glass windows that had been crafted by long-dead artisans began to emit their own light, and the wooden pews creaked with the weight of invisible congregants from generations past who had gathered to witness this moment of revelation. Thomas Blackthorne, his caretaker's knowledge now expanded to encompass the full scope of his responsibility, understood that the cemetery had never been a repository for the dead, but a nexus point where the network's power was most concentrated. Every grave he had tended, every headstone he had cleaned, had been part of maintaining the infrastructure that allowed consciousness to persist beyond physical death. "What happens now?" asked Pastor Morrison, his traditional theology crumbling in the face of this new understanding. Abigail smiled with lips that held the wisdom of years spent in conscious death. "Now we truly live." The revelation that swept through First Baptist Church created ripples that extended far beyond the sanctuary walls, and as the congregation emerged into the October morning, their faces bearing the luminous marks of their connection to Ravenshallow's supernatural network, they encountered a town in the grip of unprecedented change. Word of the awakening had spread through the community with supernatural speed, carried by the very network that connected all residents. In homes throughout the valley, families discovered that their connection to deceased loved ones had become tangible, immediate, and undeniably real. Children spoke with grandparents who had died before their birth. Widows embraced husbands whose physical forms remained buried, but whose consciousness flowed through the living network like electricity through copper wire. Mayor Cornelius Ashworth, a pragmatic man who had governed Ravenshollow for 12 years, found himself face to face with his predecessor, former Mayor Benjamin Frost, who had died of heart failure in 1881. The encounter took place in the town hall, where Frost materialized from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. "Cornelius," Frost said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect throughout the community. "The time has come for Ravenshollow to acknowledge what it has always been, a place where death holds no dominion, where consciousness persists beyond the grave, where the boundary between living and dead exists only in the minds of those who fear to accept the truth." Similar encounters occurred throughout the town as the awakened dead emerged not just from the cemetery, but from every corner of Ravenshollow where their memories lingered strongest. The blacksmith shop filled with the sound of hammering as Jeremiah Morse resumed his work alongside his living apprentices. The schoolhouse echoed with the voices of teachers who had died decades earlier, but whose knowledge remained accessible through the network. Dr. Thornfield established a makeshift medical station in the town square, attempting to document and understand the physiological changes occurring in both the awakened dead and the living residents who were integrating with the network. His findings defied medical explanation. The awakened showed no signs of decomposition despite their years in the ground, while the living exhibited enhanced vitality, improved health, and expanded mental capacity. "We face a choice," announced Mayor Ashworth to the gathered townspeople, his voice carrying across the square where living and dead mingled with increasing comfort. "We can embrace this gift and accept our role as guardians of something beyond normal human experience, or we can flee from what we do not understand." The assembled residents, both living and awakened, looked to one another for guidance, their individual fears balanced against the undeniable wonder of their expanded consciousness and reunited community. What choice would you make if faced with immortality that defied every natural law? As the initial wonder of reunion wore away, the true implications of Ravenshollow's supernatural blessing began to manifest in ways that challenged the community's newfound harmony. Dr. Thornfield's medical examinations revealed disturbing patterns that suggested their miraculous resurrection came with costs that had not been immediately apparent. The awakened dead, while conscious and intelligent, required sustenance that transcended normal nutritional needs. They drew energy directly from the living network, creating a symbiotic relationship that demanded careful balance. Too many awakened in one area could drain the vitality from nearby living residents, causing weakness, premature aging, and, in extreme cases, accelerated death followed by immediate resurrection into the network. Young Timothy Fletcher, who had been among the first living residents to connect fully with the network, began showing signs of physical deterioration despite his enhanced consciousness. As his parents Martha and David Fletcher watched in growing horror as their son's body seemed to burn itself out like a candle flame consuming its wick too rapidly. "The boy is becoming a conduit," Dr. Thornfield explained to the increasingly concerned townspeople gathered in the church. "His living body cannot sustain the level of network activity flowing through it. He's aging years in a matter of days." Abigail Whitmore listened to these concerns with expressions that mixed compassion with inevitability. "The network requires balance," she acknowledged, her luminous gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "Some must give more than others to maintain the connections that allow us all to persist beyond normal death." The revelation that their paradise came with such costs created the first real division among Ravenshollow's residents. Families with young children began to question whether the gift of reunion with deceased loved ones was worth risking the lives of their living offspring. Elderly residents, closer to natural death themselves, showed more willingness to embrace the network's demands. Pastor Morrison struggled with theological implications that grew more complex by the hour. "If this is divine blessing," he asked during an emergency town meeting, "why does it require sacrifice from the innocent? What kind of God demands that children pay the price for their elders' continued existence?" Thomas Blackthorne, his intimate knowledge of the cemetery's patterns spanning decades, offered a disturbing observation. "The awakening began with our most recently deceased," he noted, "but it's spreading to older graves. Every resurrection requires more energy from the network. If this continues, we may face a choice between the living and the dead." The October sky darkened as storm clouds gathered over the valley, and the residents of Ravenshollow found themselves confronting questions that no community in human history had ever faced. How many living souls were they willing to sacrifice to maintain their connection with the dead? Will you sacrifice the young to preserve the old, or would you choose a different path entirely? The supernatural network that connected Ravenshollow's living and dead began to exact its heaviest toll on the community's youngest residents. Children, with their naturally high life force and unburdened consciousness, proved to be the most efficient conduits for the energy required to maintain the awakened dead, making them involuntary sacrifices in a system they were too young to understand or resist. 8-year-old Margaret Whitmore, granddaughter of the awakened Abigail, collapsed during afternoon lessons at the schoolhouse. Her teacher, Mrs. Hartwell, herself one of the resurrected, watched in growing alarm as the child's vibrant health drained away like water from a broken vessel. Margaret's auburn hair turned grey within hours, her smooth skin developed the texture of aged parchment, and her bright eyes took on the hollow appearance of someone decades older. Dr. Thornfield's examination revealed that Margaret was aging at an accelerated rate, her young body burning through years of natural development to provide the energy her grandmother required to maintain her resurrected state. The process appeared irreversible. Once a child became a primary conduit for the network, they would continue aging rapidly until they died of premature old age, at which point they would immediately join the ranks of the awakened dead. "This cannot continue," declared David Fletcher, holding his own rapidly aging son Timothy in arms that shook with rage and grief. "We cannot allow our children to be consumed to feed the dead, no matter how much we love and miss them." But the awakened dead seemed incapable of breaking their connection to the network voluntarily. Abigail Whitmore, faced with the reality of her granddaughter's sacrifice, showed genuine anguish but claimed powerlessness. "To stop the energy drain, the network sustains us without our conscious control," she explained, her luminous tears leaving glowing tracks on her pale cheeks. "We cannot simply choose to stop, drawing life from the living any more than you can choose to stop breathing. The revelation split families along previously unimaginable lines. Parents found themselves opposing their own deceased relatives in battles over their children's lives. Grandparents who had returned from the grave to share wisdom and love discovered that their very presence was killing the grandchildren they sought to protect. Pastor Morrison organized prayer vigils in desperate attempts to find divine intervention, while Mayor Ashworth called emergency town meetings to seek political solutions to supernatural problems. Neither spiritual nor secular authority offered clear guidance for a community facing choices that transcended normal human experience. As more children throughout Ravenshollow began showing signs of accelerated aging, the townspeople realized they were confronting the fundamental question that their miraculous gift had hidden. Was reunion with the dead worth condemning the living to premature death? If this was happening to your family, what choice would you make? The systematic aging of Ravenshollow's children sparked the first organized resistance to the supernatural network that had seemed like such a blessing only days before. Led by desperate parents who watched their offspring wither like flowers in winter, a faction of living residents began planning actions that would have been unthinkable during their initial wonder at reunion with the dead. David Fletcher emerged as the unofficial leader of what became known as the Liberation Movement. His son Timothy, now appearing to be in his 50s despite his 12 chronological years, served as a living reminder of the network's terrible cost. "They may be our loved ones," Fletcher declared during a secret meeting in the abandoned grain mill outside town, "but we cannot allow them to consume our children's futures to sustain their unnatural existence." The group included nearly every family with young children, along with several childless adults who were horrified by the moral implications of the network's energy requirements. Dr. Thornfield brought medical expertise, documenting the physiological changes in affected children and searching for ways to sever their connection to the supernatural system that was draining their life force. Martha Fletcher, Timothy's mother, had begun showing signs of network integration herself as she tried desperately to share her son's burden. Her hair had started turning white, and her skin had taken on the translucent quality that marked deep connection with the awakened dead. "If we cannot save our children," she said with grim determination, "then we must find a way to end this entire nightmare." The liberation movement faced opposition not only from the awakened dead, but from living residents who had embraced the network's gifts. Elderly townspeople, many of whom had reconnected with deceased spouses and friends, viewed the children's sacrifice as tragic but necessary to maintain the miraculous community they had gained. This philosophical divide created tensions that threatened to tear Ravenshollow apart along generational lines. Thomas Blackthorne found himself caught between his loyalty to the dead he had served as caretaker and his growing horror at the network's demands on the living. His decades of intimate knowledge about the cemetery made him valuable to both factions. The liberation movement needed his insights to understand how to disrupt the network, while the awakened dead relied on his continued cooperation to maintain their resurrection infrastructure. "There has to be another way," Blackthorne confided to Dr. Thornfield during one of their clandestine meetings, "something that allows the dead their consciousness without requiring the living to pay such a terrible price." As October progressed toward its end, the battle lines in Ravenshollow became increasingly clear. Those who would sacrifice anything to maintain their supernatural paradise, and those who believed some prices were too high to pay, even for reunion with beloved dead. Which side would you choose if your family's survival depended on it? Dr. Thornfield's desperate search for medical solutions to the network's deadly demands led him to explore historical records that had been gathering dust in Ravenshollow's small library and town hall archives. Working by candlelight in the hours before dawn, when the awakened dead seemed least active, he discovered documents that suggested the community's supernatural condition was not entirely unprecedented. Hidden among routine town records from the 1740s were references to peculiar soil conditions noted by the original Puritan settlers. Reverend Obadiah Blackthorne, Thomas's ancestor and the first minister to serve the community, had documented strange phenomena in his personal journal: crops that grew with unusual vigor, livestock that lived far beyond normal lifespans, and settlers who seemed immune to diseases that ravaged neighboring communities. Most significantly, Reverend Blackthorne had recorded his suspicions about the land itself. The earth beneath Ravenshollow holds properties that transcend natural philosophy, he had written in his careful script. I fear we have built our community upon ground that was sacred to peoples who understood forces that we, in our Christian certainty, have chosen to ignore. Thomas Blackthorne, reading his ancestors' words by flickering lamplight, felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Doctor," he whispered urgently, "what if the network isn't something that just happened to our community? What if we built our town on top of something that was already here, something that the native peoples who lived here before us knew how to manage properly?" The two men began to research the pre-colonial history of their valley, seeking any record of the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the area before European settlement. Their investigations, conducted in secrecy to avoid detection by the network-integrated residents, revealed references to seasonal ceremonies and ritual practices designed to maintain balance between the living and the dead. Dr. Thornfield's medical examination of the affected children showed that their accelerated aging followed specific patterns that suggested the network drew energy according to some underlying logic rather than random consumption. Timothy Fletcher's deterioration had stabilized at what appeared to be approximately 50 years of physical age, while younger children progressed more rapidly through their stolen decades. "There's a system here," Dr. Thornfield realized as he studied his charts and measurements. "The network isn't just randomly draining life force, it's following rules that we don't understand. If we could learn those rules, perhaps we could find a way to work within them without sacrificing our children." Their research was interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the library, accompanied by the otherworldly harmony that marked the presence of the awakened dead. Through the window, they could see luminous figures moving through the town's streets, their purpose unknown but their coordination suggesting they were aware of the liberation movement's activities. Do you think some mysteries are too dangerous to solve? The breakthrough in understanding Ravenshollow's supernatural condition came from an unexpected source. Margaret Whitmore, the 8-year-old girl whose accelerated aging had stabilized her apparent physical form at approximately 30 years of age. Her transformation had left her with the accumulated wisdom of the network while retaining her essential identity, making her a bridge between the living and the awakened dead. "The people who lived here before the settlers," Margaret explained to Dr. Thornfield and Thomas Blackthorne. During a clandestine meeting in the old grain mill, they knew about the network. They called it the Eternal Web, and they had ceremonies to keep it balanced. Her adult vocabulary emerging from childish features created an unsettling contrast that emphasized the unnatural nature of her condition. Margaret's knowledge came not from her own experience, but from the collective memory stored within the network itself. Generations of consciousness dating back to the land's original inhabitants. Every autumn, she continued, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with otherworldly authority. When the boundary between worlds grew thin, they would perform rituals that allowed the dead to visit the living without permanently draining their life force. The network was meant to be temporary, seasonal, not the constant connection that we've created. Dr. Thornfield realized that the European settlers had unknowingly disrupted a delicate system that had maintained balance for centuries before their arrival. By building permanent structures over sacred ground and establishing a cemetery in what had been a ritual space, they had transformed seasonal visitation into permanent resurrection that demanded continuous energy from the living. Thomas Blackthorne examined his ancestors' journal with new understanding. Reverend Blackthorne's references to peculiar soil conditions took on different meaning when viewed as documentation of a disrupted spiritual ecosystem. The Puritan minister had sensed that something was wrong with their settlement, but had lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret what he observed. "The solution isn't to destroy the network," Margaret revealed, her transformed consciousness accessing information that no living person possessed. "It's to restore the original balance, the ceremonies that allowed controlled contact without permanent resurrection, the seasonal rhythms that let the dead visit without consuming the living." But implementing this solution would require knowledge that had been lost for over a century, ritual practices that the European settlers had either ignored or actively suppressed in their efforts to claim the land for their own purposes. The indigenous peoples who had maintained the balance were long gone, scattered or destroyed by the same colonial expansion that had created Ravenshollow's current crisis. "How do we learn ceremonies that died with the people who created them?" asked Dr. Thornfield, his scientific mind struggling with the challenge of reconstructing spiritual practices from fragmentary historical evidence. Margaret smiled with lips that belonged to a 30-year-old face but held a child's essential innocence. "We asked the network itself." The network that connected Ravenshollow's living and dead proved to be a repository of memory that extended far beyond the European settlement of the valley. When Margaret Whitmore opened her consciousness fully to its depths, she accessed experiences and knowledge from the indigenous peoples who had maintained the balance for generations before the Puritans arrived. The memories came in fragments, glimpses of ceremonies conducted beneath harvest moons, chants in languages that had no written form, ritual movements that channeled the energy of the eternal web without creating permanent disruption. Margaret served as a conduit for this ancient knowledge, her child's consciousness somehow able to process information that would have overwhelmed adult minds. "The ceremonies happened here," she explained to the assembled liberation movement, pointing toward the center of what was now Ravenshollow Cemetery. "This was never meant to be a place of permanent burial. It was a threshold space where the living could commune with the dead during the sun when the boundary between worlds grows thin." Dr. Thornfield documented everything Margaret revealed, creating detailed notes about ritual, components that seemed to blend spiritual practice with what he was beginning to recognize as primitive but effective energy management. The indigenous ceremonies had apparently created controlled conditions for temporary resurrection that honored the dead without depleting the living. The key element was timing. The rituals were designed to work with natural cycles rather than against them. The autumn season, when the boundary between life and death became permeable, was the proper time for such communion. By conducting year-round resurrections, the European settlers had created a constant drain on the network that required escalating energy input to maintain. "We need specific materials," Margaret continued, her adult vocabulary describing requirements that challenged the community's available resources. Sacred plants that grew in this valley before European agriculture changed the soil composition, ritual tools made from local stone and wood according to traditional methods, and most importantly the willing participation of both living and dead in returning to seasonal rather than permanent connection. The awakened dead, when approached with this information, showed varying degrees of cooperation. Those who had been conscious in death for only a few years expressed willingness to return to the grave if it meant saving the children. Others, particularly those who had been awakened for longer periods, resisted the idea of giving up their restored existence. Abigail Whitmore faced the most difficult choice of all. Supporting the ritual that would save her granddaughter Margaret meant accepting her own return to unconscious death. "The network has shown me wonders beyond imagination," she told the gathered community, "but no wonder is worth the sacrifice of innocence." As Halloween approached, bringing with it the natural thinning of boundaries that might make a restoration ritual possible, Ravenshollow prepared for a ceremony that would determine whether their community could find balance between the living and the dead. The final week of October 1887 transformed Ravenshollow into a community unlike any in human history, where the living and dead worked together to prepare for a ceremony that would reshape their supernatural existence. The liberation movement, now supported by several awakened dead who prioritized the children's welfare over their own continued consciousness, began gathering the materials and knowledge necessary for the restoration ritual. Margaret Whitmore, her consciousness serving as a bridge between worlds, guided the collection of plants and minerals that had grown in the valley before European settlement. Some species had survived in the deepest parts of the surrounding forest, while others required careful cultivation using seeds preserved in the network's collective memory. Dr. Thornfield found himself learning botany and geology alongside medicine as he helped identify materials that possessed the spiritual properties necessary for the ceremony. Thomas Blackthorne led efforts to prepare the cemetery itself for transformation. The ritual required returning the space to its original function as a threshold rather than a permanent repository. Headstones would need to be temporarily removed, graves would need to be ritually opened and blessed, and the entire 5-acre space would need to be consecrated according to practices that predated Christian settlement. The awakened dead contributed their own preparations, sharing knowledge and experiences they had gained during their time in conscious death. Rebecca Caldwell, despite her child's appearance, possessed insights into the network's energy flows that proved invaluable for understanding how to redirect the system's power away from consuming the living. But preparation was complicated by growing resistance from some awakened dead who refused to accept their return to unconscious death, led by Jeremiah Morse, whose powerful blacksmith's frame gave him considerable influence. A faction of the resurrected began actively sabotaging the ritual preparations. "You ask us to surrender eternity for the sake of children who will die anyway within decades," Morse declared during a confrontation in the town square. "We have tasted immortality, we have seen beyond the veil of death, and you expect us to return willingly to darkness and silence." The division created dangerous tensions within the network itself. Living residents found themselves caught between conflicting energy draws as different factions of awakened dead competed for their life force. Children throughout the community began aging more rapidly as the network destabilized, their bodies burning through decades of development in a matter of days. Timothy Fletcher, now appearing to be nearly 70 years old despite his 12 chronological years, served as a living reminder of what was at stake. His parents maintained constant vigil, knowing that each day of delay brought their son closer to death and potential resurrection into a system they were fighting to restore to balance. As Halloween night approached, Ravenshollow faced the question that would define its future. Could a community choose temporary communion with the dead over permanent paradise built on the sacrifice of innocence? October 31st, 1887 dawned grey and cold over Ravenshollow, with mist rising from the cemetery grounds like the breath of sleeping spirits. The natural thinning of boundaries between worlds that occurred annually on this night would provide the optimal conditions for the restoration ritual, but it would also amplify the network's power, making the ceremony both more possible and more dangerous. The community had split into 3 distinct factions: the Liberation Movement led by David Fletcher and supported by Dr. Thornfield, the awakened dead, who favored returning to seasonal communion, and the Resistance faction of resurrected individuals who refused to surrender their permanent existence. The tension between these groups created visible disturbances in the network itself, causing lights to flicker in homes throughout the valley and making the air itself seem to pulse with supernatural energy. Margaret Whitmore, now serving as the primary conduit between all factions, began showing signs of severe strain as Halloween evening approached. Her body, already aged beyond her chronological years, struggled to channel the increasing energy flows as the boundary between worlds grew thinner. Dr. Thornfield monitored her condition with growing alarm, realizing that she might not survive the ritual designed to save her and the other affected children. As darkness fell, the cemetery began to glow with an otherworldly luminescence that was visible from every home in Ravenshollow. The awakened dead gathered in their family plots, while living residents assembled at the cemetery gates with the materials and knowledge necessary for the restoration ceremony. The air filled with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself, creating music that no human composer could have imagined. Thomas Blackthorne, carrying the weight of his family's century-long connection to this sacred ground, began the ritual opening by removing the iron gates that had separated the living from the dead. As the barriers fell away, the distinction between cemetery and town began to blur, creating a threshold space that extended throughout the entire valley. The Resistance faction, led by Jeremiah Morse, made their final attempt to sabotage the ceremony by overwhelming the network with demands for energy. Children throughout Ravenshollow began aging at accelerated rates as the rebellious dead drew power without restraint. Timothy Fletcher collapsed in his father's arms, his elderly appearance making him nearly unrecognizable as the 12-year-old boy he had been only weeks before. "Begin the ceremony now," urged Abigail Whitmore, her luminous tears reflecting the supernatural aurora that danced above the cemetery. before the resistance destroys everything we've tried to preserve. The restoration ritual would require precise timing, exact materials, and the coordinated effort of both living and dead working toward the same goal. As midnight approached, Ravenshollow prepared to discover whether their community could find balance between worlds or would tear itself apart in the attempt. At the stroke of midnight on Halloween 1887, Margaret Whitmore began the restoration ritual with words in a language that had not been spoken in Ravenshollow for over a century. The ancient phrases flowed from her lips as if she were remembering rather than learning, her consciousness accessing the collective memory of indigenous peoples who had maintained the sacred balance for generations. The ceremony required the participation of representatives from both the living and the dead, their combined energy redirecting the network from permanent resurrection towards seasonal communion. Dr. Thornfield and Thomas Blackthorne stood with David Fletcher and other living residents, while Abigail Whitmore and Rebecca Caldwell represented the awakened dead who supported the restoration. As Margaret spoke the ritual words, the cemetery began to transform around them. Headstones sank into the earth as if the ground itself were reclaiming them, while the neat pathways that Thomas had maintained for decades dissolved into the natural contours of the original sacred space. The iron gates that had marked boundaries melted into pools of metal that were absorbed by soil that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The resistance faction led by Jeremiah Morse made a final desperate attempt to maintain their permanent resurrection by drawing massive amounts of energy from the living resident. The attack was so sudden and powerful that several adults aged decades in minutes, their life force burning away like candles in a hurricane. But Margaret had anticipated this assault. Using knowledge gained from the network's deepest memories, she redirected the stolen energy back toward its sources, creating a feedback loop that forced the rebellious dead to experience the full cost of their selfish resurrection. Morse and his followers found themselves confronting the accumulated pain of every child they had aged, every life they had shortened, every natural cycle they had disrupted. "Feel what you have taken," Margaret commanded, her child's voice carrying the authority of ancient wisdom. "Experience the price that others have paid for your continuation." The feedback proved too much for the resistance faction to bear. One by one, they released their hold on the network's energy and allowed themselves to sink back into the earth, returning to the unconscious rest they had abandoned in their desperate pursuit of permanent existence. As the rebellious dead returned to their graves, the children of Ravenshollow began to reverse their accelerated aging. Timothy Fletcher's elderly appearance started to fade, his wrinkled skin smoothing and his white hair returning to its natural brown. The restoration was not instantaneous, but the process had clearly begun. The cemetery itself continued to transform, becoming less of a formal burial ground and more of a natural sacred space where the boundary between worlds remained permeable but balanced. Would you have trusted ancient wisdom over modern desires for permanent reunion? As dawn broke over Ravenshollow on November 1st, 1887, the community awakened to a transformed reality that honored both the living and the dead without sacrificing either to sustain the other. The restoration ritual had succeeded in returning the network to its original function, creating seasonal communion rather than permanent resurrection that demanded continuous energy from the living. The children who had suffered accelerated aging during the crisis were healing, their bodies gradually returning to their natural developmental stages. Timothy Fletcher, though still bearing traces of his supernatural ordeal, smiled with genuinely 12-year-old joy as he regained his proper appearance. Dr. Thornfield documented the recovery process with scientific fascination, noting that the reversal seemed to follow the same mysterious logic that had governed the original aging. Margaret Whitmore retained her dual nature as both child and conduit, but her connection to the network had stabilized at a sustainable level. She would serve as Ravenshollow's bridge between worlds, helping to maintain the balance that allowed seasonal communion without permanent disruption. Her sacrifice had been great, but it had preserved both her own life and the lives of every other child in the community. The cemetery had been transformed into something between its original sacred grove and a traditional burial ground. Headstones remained, but they were now arranged according to natural patterns rather than rigid rows, and the space itself pulsed gently with the energy of the eternal web. Thomas Blackthorne found his role as caretaker expanded to include maintaining spiritual as well as physical aspects of the sacred threshold. Most remarkably, the awakened dead had not been lost entirely. During certain times of the year, particularly the autumn season when boundaries naturally thinned, they could still manifest and communicate with the living. But these visitations were limited in duration and intensity, preventing the energy drain that had threatened to consume Ravenshollow's children. Abigail Whitmore appeared to her family on the first evening after the restoration, her form less solid than during her permanent resurrection, but undeniably present and conscious. "The network remembers," she told her grandee. Or to Margaret, her voice carrying across dimensions without depleting living energy. "Love transcends death, but it need not consume life to prove its reality." Pastor Morrison struggled to reconcile these events with traditional Christian doctrine, but eventually developed a theology that embraced mystery as an essential component of faith. The church became a place where both living and dead were welcome during the seasonal periods of communion, creating worship experiences that transcended normal religious understanding. Dr. Thornfield established new medical protocols for monitoring the community's supernatural health, ensuring that future generations would understand both the benefits and risks of their unique relationship with death and resurrection. The balance had been restored, but vigilance would be required to maintain it. Ravenshollow had learned that some gifts come with responsibilities that extend beyond individual desire. Years passed in Ravenshollow with the rhythm of seasons marking periods of communion and separation between the living and the dead. The community had learned to honor their unique gift while respecting the boundaries that prevented it from consuming those it was meant to serve. Children grew up understanding that death was not an ending but a transformation that required careful balance to maintain harmony between worlds. Margaret Whitmore, now grown to natural adulthood, served as the community's guardian of the network, monitoring its energy flows and ensuring that the seasonal resurrections remained sustainable. Her childhood sacrifice had given her unique insights into the eternal web's function, making her indispensable to maintaining the delicate equilibrium that allowed Ravenshollow to exist as a threshold between worlds. Dr. Thornfield's son, Jonathan, inherited his father's medical practice along with the responsibility of documenting and preserving the knowledge necessary to maintain the community's supernatural balance. The medical records of Ravenshollow became a unique chronicle of humanity's relationship with death, resurrection, and the persistence of consciousness beyond physical existence. Thomas Blackthorne trained apprentices in the dual arts of cemetery maintenance and spiritual stewardship, ensuring that future generations would understand both the practical and mystical aspects of their role as guardians of sacred space. The cemetery remained a place of power that required constant attention to prevent the network from slipping back into the permanent resurrection that had nearly destroyed the community. The seasonal communions became Ravenshollow's most treasured traditions, times when families could reunite with deceased loved ones for brief but meaningful interactions that enriched both the living and the dead without consuming either. Children learned to speak with grandparents they had never met in life, while adults found comfort in knowing that death was not the absolute separation they had once feared, but vigilance was essential. Every few years, someone would attempt to extend the communion beyond its natural limits, seeking permanent resurrection like that which had nearly destroyed the community in 1887. These attempts were gently but firmly discouraged by those who remembered the true cost of disrupting the balance. As the 19th century drew to a close, Ravenshollow stood as proof that humanity could coexist with forces beyond normal understanding, provided they approached such power with wisdom, restraint, and respect for the natural order that governed both life and death. The cemetery gates, rebuilt from materials blessed by both Christian and indigenous traditions, bore a simple inscription that served as a reminder to all who entered. "Here rest those who live beyond death, and here live those who honor the rest of death." The graves no longer refused to stay closed. Instead, they opened and closed according to rhythms older than human memory, maintaining the eternal balance between worlds that would define Ravenshollow for generations to come. I want to hear your theory in the comments below. Do you believe some communities are meant to guard mysteries that transcend normal human experience?